evening. Thank you for joining us for another of our Teleart Works online lectures. Before we begin, I should like to give you some information about the Atelier at Flowerfield, a 501c3c not-for-profit organization. We're currently in our Spring 2 session, and we offer a variety of fine art drawing and painting classes in a variety of mediums, both online and in studio. We also offer classes in digital painting. Details can be found on our website, theatelieratflowerfield.org. Our current exhibition is Lockdown and Beyond, which runs until June 15th. That's extended from its previous date of May 15th. And the next exhibition will be Breakout, which will actually be another exhibition of student and teachers' work. Tonight's lecture is being sponsored by First Republic Private Wealth Management. The lecture is entitled Ralph Fasanella, An American Tragedy, and is being given by Marc Fasanella. We welcome him this evening, and we hope you enjoy tonight's lecture. If you wish to ask questions, please post them in the chat room, and we will answer the questions after the lecture. I shall now hand over to Marc. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'll just give you a brief idea who I am. I am actually the adopted son of Ralph Fasanella. My mother didn't want people to know I was adopted. But I am the adopted son of Ralph Fasanella, and he adopted me when he was in his 50s, and I was adopted near birth. And I really could not have had a better childhood, so I'm a poster child for adoption. If anybody's interested in adoption, you can always reach out to me, and I'll fill you in. But basically, I want to launch into the lecture, An American Tragedy, and on the way through the lecture, I'll kind of explain why it is that title. It's not that my father was an American tragedy. It's that American tragedies are something that we hadn't seen before. So this graphic was designed by a fantastic young woman named Naomi Johnson, who has been working with me on the development of a website that I'll tell you about at the end. And we have put together an online exhibit. The slides that you're going to see today are that online exhibit, and we are looking for a physical home for the exhibit in the year 2024 in advance of the next presidential election, 2023-2024. It's a small set of paintings. You'll see all the paintings in the exhibit, and I'll tell you how to find out more about the exhibit at the end of the presentation. So my father, Ralph Fasanella, was born in 1914, and he passed away in 1997, and that really gives you an idea that his life pretty much spanned. It's amazing. Alice Neal, there's an Alice Neal exhibit up right now, and her lifespan was very similar to my father's. She was born a little bit before, but his lifespan spanned the 20th century. When he was a young man or child, grew up in New York City, his father had an ice wagon, as I'll tell you a little more about, and he got to see in his lifetime the advent of radio, automobiles, refrigeration, and it really was a completely, a huge change that happened in his lifetime, according to technology. So he was a young man who grew up in New York City, and he got into all kinds of shenanigans growing up in Little Italy, but at a later point in his life, he became a self-taught social realist artist, primarily a painter. And he really did have no formal schooling. He took a few art classes, didn't enjoy them. And his epitaph on his tombstone is this phrase, is remember who you are, remember where you came from, don't forget the past, change the world. It's not a phrase that he came up with. I've heard it attributed to other people, but it is something that he said all the time. And he used to say to me and young people all the time, change the world, as he was leaving a room. These are his parents, Ginevra and Giuseppe Fasanella. They were both from a little medieval city in Italy called Lavello. And those are the brood of children that they had. They ended up actually having 6 children, although they only see 5 there. My father is the one, you can see him here. And his mother had a tremendous influence on him. She became radicalized by her work. And eventually my grandfather, Giuseppe, and it's funny when I took this photograph the other day, he kind of came out ghosted because of the way the light was coming in the room. I have this portrait hanging in my living room. And that was kind of apropos because he worked as an iceman in New York City, and then refrigeration started happening. You can see his ice wagon down at the bottom of the painting. And he really became broken by his work. And that's why my father depicted him in this painting on a cross. So he was an immigrant who failed. We always hear about the story of immigrants that succeed in the United States. It's a great, Dickensian rags to riches tale, but he was actually a failure. He had these children, his ice route was being replaced by refrigeration. He was making less and less money. And his wife, Ginevra, had an affair, which I'll talk a little bit more about. So my father's relationship with his father became troubled, and he was in and out of school working on my grandfather's ice route. My father, Ralph Fasanella, was working on my grandfather's ice route. And he ended up in a Catholic protectorate several times for truancy, for petty theft. And this is what the Catholic protectorate was like. It was actually a prison run by the Catholic diocese. And you can see the children over on the right-hand side doing penance. They would have to stand there for 6-8 hours a day, their hands over their head. And if they tried to lower their arms, they got hit with a stick. You can see the monk watching over them there. And things were very formalized and regimented. And that was partially because of his relationship with his father, who was really having a very difficult time. And he could see his father failing. So, the relationship between a father and son is very important. But his relationship with my mother, his mother, my grandmother, Ginevra, really blossomed. And this is a painting that you can see at Ellis Island Museum. That last painting is at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. I donated it to the Smithsonian American Art Museum several years ago. But here you can see my grandmother, Ginevra. You can see her here in the center of the painting, crucified on a cross, but not with ice tongs, as you see in the previous paintings that my grandfather was in, but with thread. And you can see the children at her waist, and you can see her at the center of the table with her family, and you can see the trundle bed that the children slept on. There were people sleeping in the kitchen, so they pull out this bed in the kitchen. She worked in this factory. This is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. And the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, prior to my mother and father, he also worked there as a buttonhole presser, had been the site of a tremendous American tragedy. I don't know if you've heard that story, but in 1911, there were a bunch of young women who were caught in a fire. The exits were blocked in the same room, sewing room. The exits were blocked. So even though this was a very difficult place to work, and it was the site of this incredible American tragedy, if you look up the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, you will see the story of it. It was mostly young immigrant women who had to jump from the windows because the exits were blocked and died in the fall. That building is now owned by NYU. It's part of NYU's campus right on Greenwich Village, right near Greenwich Village. But my grandmother, Ginevra, became radicalized by her experience in this factory. And she began to read books. She was literate. She began to read books. My grandfather, Giuseppe, was not literate. And so he ended up going back to the little town Lavello in Italy as a failed immigrant. And she ended up kind of blossoming into an intellectual. And that is what affected my father and eventually made him a kind of working class artist. So that leads us to the series of paintings that he did throughout the course of his lifetime that I think chronicle the political life of the 20th century. And I titled the exhibit, working with this young woman, Naomi Johnson, American Tragedy. She made this beautiful collage of the different paintings you're going to see. Because one of the things that we hear all the time now that we're in a pandemic and we went through a very tumultuous presidency is that these are unprecedented times. People are constantly saying that, oh, we've never seen anything like this. We've never been through anything like this before. And that's not true. We've been through times that are every bit as challenging, in some case worse. And I'll make reference to some other times in history, but certainly in American history, we've been through some incredibly difficult times. If you think about that time my father was born in 1914, that was right, after World War I, right? He kind of came into his infancy after World War I and then came into his adulthood in World War II. So it really was incredibly challenging times. This is a painting he made in 1948 that's owned by the Fenimore Art Museum called May Day. The Fenimore Art Museum is in Cooperstown. And you can see, when I say become radicalized, there was a tremendous left-wing movement in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s in the United States. And May Day is an American holiday. It's a holiday that was created for American workers, and it is now celebrated all over the world. It's a huge holiday in Switzerland, Germany. I think they even have big May Day festivals in Israel. So it's a very important international holiday. But the United States, because of its political significance as being associated with the left-wing movement of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, it was replaced by Labor Day. And we don't really celebrate May Day other than to say Happy May Day. But for many years, there were huge May Day parades in Union Square. And they had a giant maypole, and they decorated Union Square with flowers. And you can see my father kind of capturing as a very early, like he didn't start painting till his 30s. So this is one of his first paintings, and it's a big canvas. You can see that the measurements down the right-hand corner are 50 inches by 80 inches. And so this is one of his big monumental political canvases with his political heroes from the time, you know, Karl Marx and Engels and many other luminaries of the left-wing movement. And one of the things is, I won't go through all the details in the paintings because there are so many. There is a fantastic essay about this painting on the website that I'm going to direct you to at the end of this presentation, written by Paul D'Ambrosio. Paul D'Ambrosio is now the CEO of the Fenimore Art Museum. And he wrote his dissertation on my father and published a book called Fasanella's America, which is available. It's out of print, but it's still available online. And Paul really explains many of the details in this painting and its importance in my father's work. And you can see a tremendously positive mood. It's 1948, a tremendously positive mood in this painting. It looks a little bit darker in some ways, but that's partially because of its age. When it was originally painted, it was a very bright painting. But then we get to 1954, and this is a painting called Garden Party. And at the center of the painting, you see Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, surrounded by the books that influenced them. If you know the story of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, they were both executed. They were electrocuted in the electric chair. They were executed in the electric chair. And they were real symbols of the McCarthy era, bringing an end to a left-wing movement that had been on the rise through the 20s, 30s, and 40s, a period my father became a union organizer and then a painter by the time he reached his 30s. And so what you see here is, while the Rosenbergs are being executed and they're being burned alive in this image with the books that influenced them, and there was a huge outcry amongst intellectuals, especially Jewish intellectuals at the time, secular Jewish intellectuals, who were progressive, seeing it as an anti-Semitic act in that time when the United States had, in the beginning of World War II, really greatly supported fascism. In fact, my father volunteered to fight in Spain. And the next lecture I'll give, similar to this lecture, I'll give you information on that lecture, will be for the Abraham Lincoln Brigade Archives, which is a group my father volunteered with in Spain. But you see the Rosenbergs in the middle of this kind of White House lawn, while the military industrial complex behind them is celebrating with a Last Supper type dinner. And you can see, you know, kind of the elite having this wonderful garden party while the Rosenbergs are being executed. And even more powerfully in this painting, you see the court, and there's actually a blind judge in the back of this courtroom. So it's blind justice. And you see kind of this debauched, almost ghoul-like cabal of wealthy elites, including the military industrial complex. You see both the Navy and the Army celebrating a triumph over a left-wing movement of this painting made in 1963, looking back on the Rosenbergs. And over here, you see the mourners, now not picketing en masse, but turning their backs because the Rosenbergs have been executed. And you see people crying here, some with yarmulkes, really mourning the death of this incredible progressive movement. And here the Rosenbergs are sitting on an electric chair that uses the symbolism that my father picked up from the Catholic Protectorate. So this giant A that you see in the painting in the center is both a structure of an oil derrick. And so these are the flames coming out of an oil derrick. It's also the scarlet letter A. It is also a symbol for the atomic bomb. And then this is a symbol up at the top of a mushroom cloud, and our use of atomic weapons in World War II. Nagasaki and Hiroshima were some of the worst things that have ever happened to humanity, like the Holocaust. So he's kind of trying to capture all of that, as well as his background in this textile factory, and also the picketers and the other prisoners who were being kept in jail, and the two children of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, Robbie and Michael Meeropol. It's a very interesting story. If you don't know the story, Robbie and Michael Meeropol were adopted by Abel Meeropol and his wife. Abel Meeropol is the author of the very famous Billie Holiday song, Strange Fruit, about hangings in the South, lynchings in the South. So my father was really trying to give a kind of pulse of what was happening in the country through this oil on canvas painting, and in several other paintings. This is the painting the title of the exhibit came from, called American Tragedy. That last painting, by the way, there's an essay available online now in the catalog for the online exhibit that I wrote called A Dark Sky. This next painting, Paul has written a fantastic long essay describing this painting, because there is so much symbolism. You see the Ku Klux Klan, you see Ruby's carousel. This is a combination of Goldwater and Johnson riding over Kennedy's grave. There you see Kennedy. The grassy knoll is up here. Civil rights workers, there's Kennedy, before the grassy knoll. Civil rights workers, protesters being taken away. As the Black Lives Matter movement is continuing this civil rights struggle that my father's depicting up here with the burning of buses, and then again the atom bomb and the military-industrial complex. So you have people wearing those kind of metal helmets that people used to wear on oil rigs, and the Ku Klux Klan and military figures kind of dancing around celebrating the industrial wealth of the atomic age, and then the burning of two buses. So when you study these canvases, and there's a fantastic essay, as I said, by Paul D'Ambrosio about this painting in the exhibit catalog, you really can unpack them. There's a whole type of art education called object-based art education, and it's used in anthropology and other fields, where you unpack, you take something, it could be a chair, but in this case it's a painting, and you start unpacking what the different elements of the painting are and looking at its symbolism. Again, you see these oil derricks that are also missile silos. And we're still fighting so many of the same battles. You see the Confederate flag. This is a painting made in 1963 also. And again, you can see the sizes of these paintings. They're all monumental paintings. This is 40 inches by 70 inches. And this is called McCarthy Press. And if we had time and it was a lecture just about this canvas, I could walk through the different headlines, and you could take time and walk through different headlines. This painting is owned by the American Folk Art Museum. And so it is sometimes on view, or they have a great study center in Queens. You could reach out to that study center. And again, you see the mourners for the Rosenbergs here, and all of the headlines about how the Yanks are great and the Reds are not so great, and things that are happening in South Korea. So it really is important to understand that this time that we're living in, where we're on the brink of nuclear war with South Korea, we have assassinations of individuals. We had assassination of Osama bin Laden, and we by our president Obama. So it's a time that we've lived through before. We lived through World War II. We lived through the Holocaust. We lived through an incredibly right-wing press, and these huge groups of people that led to the execution of a couple. Now, Julius Rosenberg, there is some speculation. They say there are government officials who say it's been proven that he was a spy, and that's based on a series of tapes called the Venona tapes, where on these tapes that after the fall of the Soviet Union, they found reference to a spy whose code name was Jules, and they assumed that was Julius Rosenberg. Ethel has been completely exonerated of any culpability in the crime that they were executed for, and that crime was giving the secret of the atomic weapon to the Soviet Union. This is another painting depicting the Kennedy years. Again, you see the Rosenbergs at the center, and kind of the Olympics. My father loved sports. He loved baseball. In fact, we could do a whole exhibit of his baseball paintings because he painted so many of them. And there's a painting at the Fenimore Art Museum called Yankee Stadium that was in the Baseball Hall of Fame for many years in Cooperstown. And this painting's at the Fenimore Art Museum. But what he's depicting here is kind of sports partially as the opiate of the people. It's a great distraction from the economic powers. You see this kind of wheel up at the top that's like the wheel of fortune, or you see they've got coins that they're dropping into this missile silo, and then it's going into this giant economic casino that represents the American economy. If you think about unprecedented times and the times we live in, it's very strange that they're just printing money and giving it away. But here you see my father trying to depict kind of, down here is a boxing match that took place in 1962 and 1963, and it's everybody's betting on it and gambling on it. So it's that notion that the stock market, investment in oil wealth, the investment in the atomic bomb, the investment in the military industrial complex represented by this missile silo is all this kind of economic crapshoot where they're just kind of betting on a future, which feels very apropos in these times. Another similar painting called Mad 60s. You see the Rosenbergs appearing here, the Yankees appearing here, the sports, the opiate of the people. And again, this cabal, the military industrial complex, the atomic bomb. So really, if you think about that whole era, we're very lucky we didn't have a catastrophic nuclear accident. And there were times when we came very close to nuclear war. So in terms of the times we're living in today being unprecedented, it's not necessarily true. This is a great painting called A-Bomb. And my father ran a gas station for many years. He was blacklisted during the McCarthy era. So he couldn't get work. And as a union organizer, he couldn't get work. In fact, there was the United Electrical Workers has put out a fantastic booklet called Them and Us, describing how the labor movement in the United States was kind of pushed into a anti-left-wing stance, anti-progressive stance, and became what are called company unions and also craft unions where carpenters have their own union, and they became very specialized, and the wages were driven to a rate that ended up actually damaging the overall longevity of union labor. So during that time when he was blacklisted, he ended up taking on running a gas station. So that's why you see these mufflers on the side of this kind of fantastical automobile that is the great, engine of the American innovation and technology. So you can see the transmission down here and engineers working on getting this technological marvel of the American economy. And he's giving these slices of what makes for our culture. This is a fantastic painting at the Smithsonian Museum of American Art, Smithsonian American Art Museum, called Modern Times. And here he's also looking at this link in this section between the kind of center right panel, because this is actually a triptych. You can see there are 3 panels because the center one became too small for him. You can see lines down the canvas that it's a triptych. So to the right of the center panel, you can see a museum where there's this crossover between science and art, and science becomes kind of lionized. We become very myopic, and we begin to see the world through this lens that technology and science will save us, and it also becomes a very elite world. And he was really making reference to the Museum of Modern Art, which started at a very grassroots place, the Museum of Modern Art. If you go out to the Art Barge and you see the Richard D'Amico Institute and how their art education program is run, it's very different than what the Museum of Modern, and that was related to the Museum of Modern Art. D'Amico taught art education at Museum of Modern Art. It's very different than what it's become of this kind of highly rarefied context that's based in wealth and privilege and access. So that's what he's depicting in this modern times canvas. And this very famous visit of the Pope to Shea Stadium, which he also saw as a way to kind of distract the populace from some of the economic and military effects. This is a depiction he made of the sexual revolution. This is currently in the estate collection. That's what EC represents down in the right-hand corner. It's called Love Goddess, painted in 1964, the year that I was born. I don't know if there's any connection. And you can see it's a very bright painting. He's kind of coming out of that 1963 to 1950s to 1963 mindset and embracing what the hippies and summer of love, and you can see down here lesbian couples and homosexual couples, and he's replaced the altar with a mattress. And so it's really, and also the change in the city from these tenement buildings over here into the post-World War II apartment buildings that were using steel, and then to the really contemporary modernist buildings, Mies van der Rohe type modernist buildings. But set amidst all of it is this purple church that has this glorious courtyard full of hippies kind of enjoying this summer of love. As a reaction to the difficulties that were gone through, people have made note that the 1860s and the 1960s were very similar. So I have great hope that we're headed towards the 2060s at a time of kind of really liberal intellectual creativity. In 1972, my father was discovered by Milton Glaser. He gave Nick Pileggi the job of Clay Felker and Milton Glaser were running New York Magazine. Milton Glaser is a kind of luminary graphic designer who is most famous for, unfortunately, because his work has such an important place in graphic design history, but he's most famous for the I Love New York symbol. But he also created New York Magazine, which at the time was the magazine like Time Out is today, to find out, you know, where to get a great sandwich, what play to see. There were classified ads. It was really a very important, powerful cultural icon in New York City. And they put my father on the cover in 1972. And Nicholas Pileggi wrote this article saying, this man pumps gas in the Bronx for a living. That gas station he got because he could not get a job. So he and two other guys opened a gas station in the Bronx in a very impoverished neighborhood. He may be the best primitive painter since Grandma Moses. He was a huge appreciator of Grandma Moses's work and folk art and self-taught art, but he chafed and at the notion that he was not intellectual, because he was very much an intellectual. You can see the content of his paintings was not kind of the physical trappings of his life, the physical, visual and physical environment that he was in. It was the intellectual and emotional trappings of his life, as well as all of this experience he had in the Catholic Church with stained glass windows and the dogma of religion and the struggles of the working class, all fed through his paintbrush into paintings like this. So things really changed for my father. You see the palette becoming extremely bright, less mixing of colors because he was struggling less. And my father always said, if you see a dog that's hungry, it's always on the lookout. It's always kind of wary of its environment. You know, if a dog is extremely well fed, it's kind of relaxed and enjoys itself around the home. So he was more successful after that magazine article. He had exhibits, including the ACA Gallery in the 40s, when he picketed the ACA Gallery and said, they talk about working class art, but they won't show a working class artist. They gave him an exhibit. He had some other very important exhibits prior to 1972, but really after 1972, his career took off. And this painting, American Heritage, there's an essay about this painting in the catalog also that I wrote for the American Folk Art Museum. They had the feature of this painting in a recent exhibit a year or so ago. Here again, you see the Rosenbergs, but you see them in the middle of the White House in a much more contemporary context. And when you read the essay, you'll see that my father's comparing this kind of state funeral for politicians and the flag draping and with Martin Luther King's funeral over in the left-hand side with a donkey cart, and then the funeral of just an everyday person. This is just an everyday gentleman here. And then he has in here a memoriam of all of these kind of people he knew from his life who were just from regular walks of life, kind of making the contrast between these monumental state funerals we have for luminaries and then the smaller attention paid to other funerals. Of course, that's changed, thankfully, in some ways, due to things that have happened with the Black Lives Matter movement, but still very a small number of people who are accorded this kind of notoriety, though he felt, and I feel, that all lives are equally important and should be celebrated equally. So here you see in 1976, in a 60-inch by 96-inch painting owned by the American Folk Art Museum called Watergate. He just really can't even contain it all on a canvas. And you really would have to take time and read these headlines. And I am looking for someone to write an essay about this painting, because you can see the, economic, Wall Street trends that he's referring to up here. There's so much symbolism in it happening that Nixon, the Nixon Memorial, Watergate, my grandfather, his father's little ice wagon also makes a cameo appearance. There's so much symbol in this painting that I'd love somebody who actually lived through the Watergate era, who could spend some time and unpack this canvas. I mean, there's everything, to a swastika depicted here in this canvas, and really try to figure out all of the symbolism that would come into it. So you can see Agnew down here, Agnew and Metz in, Agnew out, Metz in. This is a painting he made when I was kind of coming of age and very good political conversant with him. We had a lot of great conversations. We went to visit his old gas station in the Bronx. And this is just coming out of that, or in that period, of Fort Apache, the Bronx. You can see the graffiti on the subway cars up here. And Milton Glacier made that logo, I Love New York, trying to get the city out of the doldrums after Ford had said, they weren't going to fund New York City. And there was that famous Daily News headline that said, Ford to city dropped dead. So here my father is trying to capture how the city has become this playground. And it was amazing because we went to his old gas station and it was being used by crack dealers, and the place was in tremendous disrepair, as the Bronx was in this time. I got off of a subway in the Bronx during this era, in the 1980s, went to the bottom of the subway platform, and there was an overturned police car that had been set on fire. And it wasn't something that made the news. It was just a regular everyday event. That's how difficult the Bronx were to live in at that time. And he had grown up the second half of his life in the Bronx. He was born in Little Italy and then moved to the Bronx as a teenager, when it was still wood frame houses and there were abandoned lots. There were even swamps that they used to build rafts. And then it had become this kind of half abandoned city, the Bronx, a part of the city. But he saw the joy that working class people had in trying to make lives, and still depicted it in these incredibly bright colors. He still saw it as a time coming out of that dark McCarthy era of anti-Semitism and racism and lynchings, and a place where there was freedom. But he always used to use the phrase, there was freedom, but there was freedom to fuck up. So people were kind of overstepping their bounds and pouring out of their buildings and squatting in buildings. And then Reagan came in, and it was a very dizzying time for my father. It was confusing for him to come through this whole trajectory where he came of age as a leftist, volunteered as what was called premature anti-fascist to fight fascism in Spain, came back, was blacklisted, went through this incredibly dark period, then went through the civil rights, got involved with the civil rights movement, and then all of the progressive ideas of the hippies and the yippies, and really fighting for a more open, more acceptable society that accepted people of all persuasions. And then in the Reagan era, there was really this kind of rollback. And when Trump came in, people said, well, there's never been somebody like Trump. And yes, they're certainly very different people. Reagan had a way of carrying himself that was very austere, not austere, but very playful and pleasant and formal, in contrast with the bombast that we dealt with recently. But the changes that he made, the United States went from being the largest creditor nation to the largest debtor nation during Reagan's presidency. And my father really understood what that represented because of his understanding of unionism and what it meant for jobs. And of course, there was the PATCO strike that really was the beginning of the end of the union movement in the United States. There were other missteps that unions themselves made. So you see the canvas once again getting more simplified, the colors getting more flat because he's becoming more disoriented and the composition becoming less complex and less information in it because he's pulling away and getting disoriented from what's happening in culture and in society. But you really would have to read all of the headlines to understand all of the messages he was putting into this painting about how society was changing. So Kremlin whiz kid grabs the reins, urges arms control, is very prophetic of the next painting called Farewell, Comrade, which was my father's last painting. He actually didn't finish it. An assistant finished this painting. And there is a fantastic essay about this painting in the catalog for this exhibit, which is available online. And again, you'd have to read the titles of the books. You can see he references Fidel Castro, Gandhi, and look at all of the different symbolism in this painting to understand how, from moving from jobs for all and free education to this time when we're seeing the collapse of the Soviet Union and the idea of the great progressive social oriented struggle that he grew up with and was part of had descended into civil war, Stalinism, CIA and the KGB, and it cost the US $90 billion to topple the Soviet Union. And that was the amount of money that was spent specifically by Reagan to build up the arms movement in the United States and get the Soviet Union into an arms race. So Reagan triples deficit with military spending. So this is the last painting my father did. The painting that he really wanted to complete before he passed away was a painting looking back at the Spanish Civil War, which happened at the beginning of his life, and how there was this tremendous effort to stop fascism in its tracks in the Spanish Civil War. And it was a failed war. They lost. Generalissimo Francisco Franco overthrew, in a military coup, overthrew a democratically elected socialist government. And the world allowed Franco for many years afterward to rule Spain as a fascist country. Of course, if Franco had been stopped, the question is, would Mussolini and Hitler have been as bold as they were? So I think these are very prophetic lessons to look at, not just in my father's work, but in other artists, and especially artists who are working today, who are bringing attention to these parts of our past. Remember the past, remember who you are, and change the world based upon these lessons from the past. The person that I think is most disturbing in these times, and perhaps most powerful as a painter, is a Indigenous painter from Canada named Kenneth Monkman. I have to give one of those warnings. Some of the images that you will see in Kenneth Monkman are very provocative and almost hard to look at. But that's what he's trying to do, is kind of paint this history that happened to the Indigenous people in Canada and poke his finger in the eye of the establishment. So that's a picture of my father in his studio. And this is really where he lived his life at its fullest, either here or enjoying a meal and conversation. And you can see one of those baseball paintings I mentioned. And I've taken his epitaph, remember the past, remember who you are, remember where you came from, don't forget the past, change the world. And I taught for 30 years. I'm now a lapsed professor. I think that the American education system, the Western education system, is something that I can no longer believe in. And if you want to get an idea of why, you can always watch the Sir Ken Robinson TED Talks. And he has a fantastic critique of how we do education in the United States according to date of manufacture and for a manufacturing system. So my message that I want to carry forward is remember the past, understand the present, and envision the future. And that's why I began to teach ecological design and now work as an ecological designer and permaculturist. So again, this exhibit was curated by myself and this fantastic young woman at Michigan State University who is studying in a digital humanities program. And her work is being sponsored by an organization called Matrix. Matrix is the Center for Digital Humanities at Michigan State University. And you'll see how to get in touch with them at the end of this presentation. And I want to thank for this exhibit, Ron Carver, John Beck, and Dean Rayberger. Ron Carver spent a good portion of his life raising money to have my father's work placed in public locations, like the family supper painting you saw at the beginning at the Ellis Island Museum. That is because of Ron Carver's work. My father's painting, Subway Riders, is in the subway station at 53rd or 54th Street near the Museum of Modern Art. That's the only painting in the Arts for Transit project, actual oil and canvas painting in the Arts for Transit project. John Beck is the person working with Ron who's kind of responsible for bringing attention at Michigan State to my father's work and setting up the website Fasanellaorg, and Dean Rayberger actually runs the Matrix organization. And there's an essay also in the catalog by Janet Zandy, who has spent her life writing about the working class and looking at how working class artists have produced work that is every bit as profound and meaningful as any other artwork out there. And I would not be able to talk about my father's work anymore without mentioning my adopted mother, Eva Fasanella. She was a school teacher, but my father would not have the notoriety that he does. The Metropolitan Museum of Art has one of my father's paintings. The Smithsonian American Art Museum has several of my father's paintings, and there are the two other major collections that I mentioned at the Fenimore Art Museum and the American Folk Art Museum. I don't think any of that would have happened, including the article in New York Magazine, without the incredible efforts of my mother, Eva Fasanella. And if you're interested in my father's work, you can get reproductions of his work at museums.co. And if you're interested in purchasing one of my father's paintings, which are in the 5 and 6 figures at times, but mostly in the 5 figures, they're available through Hill Gallery. And there will be this lecture on May 27th, similar to this, with more information about the Spanish Civil War for the Abraham Lincoln Brigade archives. And you'll be able to find that information on a website I'll direct you to. And the next exhibit about my father's work will be at the Fenimore Art Museum in Cooperstown, beginning April 1st of 2022. If you have not been to Cooperstown, it is worth the trip. It's not only about baseball, has a fantastic farmers museum, and it's really a place worth visiting. So the two places you can be directed to find out much more about my father's work is Fasanella.org, but especially Fasanella.org. I did not create this site. This site was created by Ron Carver, John Beck at Michigan State University. And it's just a coincidence that Hill Gallery, who is representing my father's work, also is in Michigan. It's a funny, happy coincidence. And we are working very hard, Naomi Johnson and Dean Rayberger and I, to make sure that any and everything you would want to know about my father's work that we can possibly make available online will be available online at Fasanella.org. So that would be the place to go to find more information about his work. If you want to know more about me, I do a website, which is marcfasanella.com. And I am happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much for a very stimulating lecture. There are some questions in the chat room. So I have Peter Lotto says, I have a signed print of your father's work that was given to my father-in-law. It depicts New York and is less political than many of the paintings, but it occupies a place of honor in my living room. P.S. I met your father at the Gulf Station in Ardsley.
Oh, wow.
And then he also says, my sister-in-law graduated from Ardsley High School in the same or close to your year.
Yep, so I graduated from Ardsley High School. Ardsley's only claim to fame is that Mark Zuckerberg graduated from, didn't graduate, excuse me, went through all of his education through his last 2 years of high school. He went to, I think, Exeter after 2 years in Ardsley High School. But it is an interesting place, and I am working with the Ardsley Historical Society slowly to put more information about my father's work on their website as well.
Does anyone else have any questions? I'll give it a couple of minutes in case anyone else has anything they want to comment on or ask. Nothing else? No one else has any questions? No, I think doesn't look like anyone does at the moment. Okay, all right. I think that's probably it as far as questions are concerned. If you do want to, do please put it in the chat room. I will keep looking. Okay, so I think what I will do then is I will thank Marc for a very interesting lecture. I hope you also found it both engaging and informative. We would also like to thank First Republic Private Wealth Management again for their sponsorship of tonight's program. And I just want to announce that our next event will be a lecture demonstration by Elizabeth Fusco on botanical illustration. She's one of our instructors and she teaches a class on botanical illustration on Mondays, if anyone's interested. And then also just to let you know, please look out for our next email about this demonstration and other upcoming events and classes. And Marc Fasanella will indeed be coming back in June to give a lecture on environmental design. So we hope you'll join us for that. And I would like to thank you very much, Marc, for coming on and wish everyone a good night. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you.